The guard handed me a clear plastic bag through the slot in the window. Inside were the clothes I'd worn the day they brought me in, jeans that probably wouldn't fit anymore because I'd grown 3 inches in 2 years, a flannel shirt my grandma had bought me for my 16th birthday, and a wallet with $12 and a school ID that had expired while I was locked up. "You're all set, Ellis," the woman said without looking at me, her fingers already moving toward the next file on her desk, the next kid being processed out of the juvenile detention center in Billings, Montana, like we were packages being shipped to wherever we came from, delivered back to lives that had kept moving without us. I took the bag and walked through the doors into February air, so cold it felt like inhaling broken glass. The parking lot stretched out in front of me, covered in snow that had been plowed into grey mountains along the edges, and beyond that, nothing but empty road and sky, the colour of old concrete. I was 18 now, legally an adult, though I'd spent the last 2 years being treated like a number in a system that didn't care if you were guilty or just unlucky enough to be standing next to someone who was. My public defender had told me to take the plea deal, said fighting it would mean risking real prison time instead of juvie, and I'd believed him because I was 16 and scared and didn't know any better. So I'd pled guilty to accessory to theft for being in a car with my cousin Marcus when he decided to rob a gas station, even though I'd been asleep in the back seat when it happened, even though I'd told the cops I didn't know what he was planning, even though the security footage showed me waking up confused when Marcus ran back to the car with a handful of cash and a look on his face like he'd just realized what a mistake he'd made. 2 years in the Montana Youth Correctional Facility. 2 years of being told when to wake up, when to eat, when to shower, when to sleep. 2 years of classes in portable buildings where teachers looked at you like you'd already failed at life. 2 years of watching my 18th birthday come and go through a window with bars on it, knowing my grandma was out there alone on the ranch, getting older, getting weaker, trying to hold on to a place that had been in our family for 60 years without anyone to help her. I'd called her every week, collect calls that cost her money she didn't have, and she'd always answered, always told me she was fine, always said not to worry about the ranch because she had it handled. But I'd heard things in her voice that scared me. A tiredness that went deeper than just being 73, a fragility that made me think of ice cracking under weight it couldn't hold anymore. The last time I'd called 3 weeks ago, a woman I didn't know had answered. She'd said my grandma had fallen, broken her hip, been taken to the hospital in Kalispell. She'd said the doctors were doing everything they could, but her voice had that careful tone people use when they're trying not to say something out loud, trying not to speak the truth into existence where it becomes real and permanent. I'd asked to speak to my grandma, but the woman said she wasn't conscious, said she was resting, said to call back in a few days. I'd called back the next day and the day after that, but no one answered. And then yesterday, the day before my release, a social worker had come to my cell and told me in that same careful voice that my grandma had passed away 4 days ago, that there'd been a small service, that I was listed as her only living relative, that I needed to contact a lawyer named Patricia Chen when I got out because there were estate matters to discuss. Estate matters. Like my grandma's whole life could be reduced to paperwork and legal terms, like the woman who'd raised me after my parents died in a car accident when I was 7, who'd taught me how to ride horses and mend fences and read the weather in the shape of clouds, could be summarized as matters that needed discussing. I stood in that parking lot holding a plastic bag and feeling nothing, not grief or anger or relief, just a vast emptiness where feeling should have been. Like I'd used up all my emotions inside and had nothing left for the outside world. A bus pulled up to the curb, its brakes hissing, and the driver looked at me through the windshield with eyes that had seen 1,000 kids like me standing in parking lots with plastic bags, trying to figure out where to go next. I got on without asking where it was going, paid my fare with some of the $12, and sat in the back, where I could watch everything, and no one could watch me. The bus drove through Billings, past fast food restaurants and strip malls and neighborhoods where houses had Christmas lights still up even though it was almost March, where normal people lived normal lives that didn't include court dates and plea deals and phone calls that never got answered. We headed west on Interstate 90, the bus stopping every 20 miles to let people off in small towns that all looked the same, gas stations and diners and churches with signs out front offering salvation to anyone who walked through the door. I rode for 4 hours, watching Montana scroll past the window like a movie I was watching instead of living in. All snow-covered fields and mountains that rose up sharp and white against grey sky. Forests of pine and spruce so thick they looked black in the fading afternoon light. When the bus finally stopped in Whitefish, I got off with my plastic bag and stood on a sidewalk dusted with fresh snow, trying to remember the phone number for Patricia Chen, the lawyer who supposedly had information about my grandma's estate. I found a payphone outside a coffee shop that smelled like espresso and cinnamon, the kind of place where people sat with laptops and looked comfortable, like they belonged somewhere and knew exactly what they were doing with their lives. I fed quarters into the slot and dialed the number the social worker had written on a piece of paper that was now crumpled and damp from being clutched in my hand for 24 hours. Patricia Chen answered on the third ring, her voice crisp and professional, the kind of voice that dealt with estate matters every day and didn't get emotional about any of them. "Mr. Ellis," she said when I told her who I was, "I've been expecting your call. First, let me express my condolences for your loss. Your grandmother spoke very highly of you. I didn't know what to say to that, didn't know how to respond to condolences from a stranger or the idea that my grandma had talked about me to her lawyer, so I just said thank you and waited for her to continue. There are some things we need to discuss regarding your grandmother's property," she went on. "The ranch has been left to you in its entirety, but there are complications, significant complications. The property taxes haven't been paid in 14 months, and there are liens from the county for various code violations and unpaid utility bills. Additionally, there's a mortgage that's 3 payments behind. In total, you're looking at approximately $31,000 in debt attached to the property. $31,000. I'd never had more than a few $100s at once in my entire life. The number was so big, it didn't connect to anything real in my mind, just floated there like something from a story about someone else's life. "What happens if I can't pay it?" I asked, my voice sounding flat even to myself. Patricia Chen paused, and I could hear papers rustling on her end. Then the bank forecloses on the mortgage, and the county auctions the property to cover the liens and back taxes. You'd receive whatever is left after those debts are settled, but given the condition of the property and the current market, there likely wouldn't be much, if anything. However, she continued, and something in her tone changed, became more careful. There is another option. I've been contacted by a development company called Summit Ridge Resorts. They're buying properties in the area for a ski resort expansion. They've offered $42,000 for your grandmother's land. After settling the debts, you'd walk away with approximately $11,000 clear. I watched snow fall past the payphone, fat flakes that dissolved when they hit the ground, and tried to imagine what $11,000 could do. It could get me an apartment somewhere, a used car, maybe community college classes if I lived cheap. It could be a start, a way to build something that wasn't connected to reformatory records and plea deals, and a system that had labeled me before I'd had a chance to prove I was anything else. "When do I have to decide?" I asked. "The bank has given you 60 days before they initiate foreclosure proceedings," Patricia said, "but Summit Ridge needs an answer within 2 weeks. They have other properties they're considering, and they won't wait indefinitely." There was something else, something she wasn't saying, and I could hear it in the spaces between her words. "What aren't you telling me?" I asked. Another pause, longer this time. "Your grandmother fought this sale very hard before she passed," Patricia said quietly. "Summit Ridge approached her multiple times over the past year, increasing their offer each time, and she refused everyone. She said the ranch wasn't for sale at any price, that it was your inheritance, your connection to family, your home. She made me promise I'd make sure you understood that before you made any decisions. My throat tightened, and I pressed my forehead against the cold metal of the payphone, trying to breathe through the pressure building in my chest. I need to see it, I said. Before I decide anything, I need to see the ranch. I can arrange that, Patricia said. Where are you now? Whitefish. I'm about 45 minutes from the property. I can meet you there tomorrow morning if that works. There's a key with the property management company, and I'll need to give you some documents to sign regardless of what you decide. That works, I said, because I had nothing else, no plan beyond getting to the ranch and seeing what my grandma had left me, what she'd fought to protect. What she'd believed was worth more than $42,000 and a clean slate. I spent that night in a motel called the Glacier Inn, paying for the room with the last of my $12 and some change I'd found in the lining of my jacket pocket. The room was small and cold, the heater rattling like it was trying to shake itself apart, but it had a bed and a shower and a door I could lock from the inside, and after 2 years of sleeping in a cell with a roommate who snored and talked in his sleep about things that made me think he needed therapy more than punishment, it felt like luxury. I lay awake most of the night, staring at water stains on the ceiling and thinking about my grandma, about the last time I'd seen her in person, the day before my sentencing when she'd come to court wearing her good dress and holding a Bible she'd brought for strength, even though she wasn't particularly religious. She'd looked small in that courtroom, smaller than I'd ever seen her, like the weight of what was happening was crushing her down into something fragile and breakable. But when the judge had read my sentence, 2 years in the youth facility, she'd sat up straight and looked at me with eyes that said, "This doesn't define you. This doesn't change who you are. This is just something we have to get through." And now she was gone, and I hadn't been there, hadn't been able to say goodbye, or thank you, or I'm sorry for being the kind of grandson who ended up in reformatory while she struggled alone on a ranch that was falling apart around her. Listen. If you've made it this far, you're invested in this story, and that means something. It means you understand what it's like to feel lost, to wonder if you'll ever find your way back to something that feels like home. If this is hitting you somewhere deep, do me a favor, hit that subscribe button right now, and drop a comment below telling me, have you ever had to choose between taking the easy way out or fighting for something that mattered, even when the odds were stacked against you? I want to hear your story because I read every single comment, and I promise you're not alone in whatever you're going through. Now let's get back to that ranch, because what I found there wasn't just about inheritance. It was about discovering who I really was when no one was watching. Patricia Chen's car was already parked at the end of the long driveway when I arrived the next morning. A silver SUV that looked out of place against the backdrop of snow and fence posts leaning at angles that suggested they'd given up trying to stay upright years ago. I'd hitchhiked from Whitefish with a truck driver named Ray, who didn't ask questions and didn't seem bothered by my silence, just drove through the pre-dawn darkness while talk radio played low enough that I couldn't make out the words. The ranch sat in a valley surrounded by mountains on 3 sides, their peaks white and sharp against a sky that was just starting to lighten from black to deep blue. The main house was a single-story log structure with a porch that wrapped around 2 sides, and even from the road, I could see the roof sagging in the middle, shingles missing in patches that exposed dark underlayment beneath. There was a barn about 50 yards from the house, its red paint faded to the color of dried blood, and beyond that, several smaller buildings I couldn't identify in the dim light. Structures that might have been a chicken coop or storage sheds or places where equipment had been kept before everything started falling apart. Patricia got out of her SUV when she saw me walking up the driveway, her breath visible in air cold enough to make my lungs ache. She wore a long wool coat and boots that looked expensive, and she carried a leather briefcase that probably cost more than everything I owned. "Mr. Ellis," she said, extending her hand. I shook it, her grip firm and brief, and followed her toward the house. The snow was deep here, untouched except for deer tracks that crossed the yard in purposeful lines, and I could see where drifts had piled against the foundation, creating barriers that would need to be shoveled before anyone could use the doors on the north side. The key stuck in the lock, and Patricia had to wiggle it for a full minute before the door finally opened with a sound like something sighing in relief. The inside of the house was dark and cold, colder somehow than the outside, like the building had been holding on to winter and refusing to let it go. Patricia found a light switch, but nothing happened when she flipped it. "Power's been shut off for non-payment," she said, pulling a flashlight from her briefcase. "We'll have to make do with this." The beam of light swept across a living room that looked frozen in time. Furniture covered with sheets, a wood stove in the corner surrounded by ashes and half-burned logs, photographs on the walls showing people I recognized and people I didn't, moments from a life that had continued long before I was part of it and had kept going even when I couldn't be there to witness it. I walked through rooms that smelled like dust and old wood and something else, the scent of a place that had been lived in and loved and then abandoned, not by choice, but by necessity. The kitchen had dishes in the sink, unwashed, like my grandma had been interrupted mid-meal and never came back to finish. There was a calendar on the wall, stopped at November, 2 months before she died, with notes written in her shaky handwriting, doctor's appointments and reminders to call the bank, and a notation on my birthday that just said Carter's Day with a small heart drawn next to it. My chest tightened again, that same pressure that made it hard to breathe, and I had to look away from the calendar, had to focus on something else, before the grief I'd been holding back since the social worker told me she was gone came crashing through whatever walls I'd built to keep it contained. Patricia led me through the rest of the house, pointing out problems with the matter-of-fact tone of someone who'd seen dozens of properties in similar condition. Water damage in the back bedroom from a roof leak that had been going on for months, cracked windows that let in drafts, a bathroom with fixtures so old they'd probably need to be completely replaced, a foundation that showed signs of settling, cracks in the walls that suggested structural issues that would cost thousands to repair. "This is what you're inheriting," she said, as we stood in what had been my grandma's bedroom, a space with a bed still made, a closet full of clothes that smelled like the lavender sachets she used to make, and a nightstand with a lamp and a book opened face down like she'd just stepped away for a moment and planned to come right back. The debt, the repairs, the reality that this place needs more money than it's worth just to make it livable again. I understand why Summit Ridge's offer might seem appealing. I walked to the window and looked out at the barn and the mountains beyond, at land that stretched for 200 acres, according to the property documents Patricia had shown me in the car, land that had been in my family since my great-grandfather bought it in 1963 with money he'd saved from working railroad jobs and sold everything he owned to make the down payment on a dream of raising cattle in a place where the sky was bigger than anywhere he'd ever been. My grandma had told me stories about growing up here, about helping her father with the horses, about winters so harsh they'd lose livestock to cold that came down from Canada like an invading army, about summers when wildflowers covered the meadows in colors so bright they didn't look real. She told me about meeting my grandpa at a dance in town, about how he'd been a soldier home from Vietnam, trying to forget things he'd seen, about how they'd built a life here together despite not having much money, despite the ranch never quite making enough to be profitable, despite everything that tried to break them. And she'd told me, in one of those collect calls from the reformatory, that this place was mine someday, that it was my history and my future, that no matter what happened or how long I was gone, there would always be a home waiting for me here. I couldn't see it then. Couldn't understand why she'd want to leave me a burden when she could have sold it and made her own life easier. Couldn't comprehend why a piece of land mattered when there were so many other things that seemed more important. But standing in her bedroom, looking at the life she'd lived and the choices she'd made, I started to understand that the ranch wasn't just property or assets or something that could be reduced to dollars and debt. It was proof that we'd existed, that we'd mattered, that there'd been a place in the world that belonged to us, even when everything else was taken away. Patricia was waiting in the living room when I came back downstairs, her flashlight creating shadows that moved across the walls like something alive. She'd set her briefcase on the coffee table and pulled out a folder thick with documents, pages that represented decisions I wasn't ready to make but couldn't avoid anymore. "Before you decide anything," she said, "there's something else you need to know. Your grandmother left you a letter. She gave it to me 6 months ago with specific instructions that you were only to receive it if you came to see the property in person. She said if you chose to sell without seeing it first, I should let you make that choice without interference. But if you came here, if you stood in this house and walked these rooms, then you deserve to know the whole truth." She handed me an envelope, yellowed and sealed with wax, that had my grandma's initials pressed into it, and my hands shook as I broke the seal and pulled out pages covered in handwriting that had gotten shakier over the years, but was still unmistakably hers, still carried the same determined slant that showed she'd written every word with purpose. "Dear Carter," it began, and I had to sit down on the sheet-covered couch because my legs suddenly didn't want to hold me anymore. "If you're reading this, it means I'm gone, and you've come home. I'm so proud of you for that, for being brave enough to face this place and everything it represents. I know it looks like a mess. I know the debt seems impossible. I know you're probably standing there thinking I was a foolish old woman who should have sold when she had the chance, who should have let go instead of holding on to something that was already lost. But there's something you need to understand, something I never told you because I was afraid of what it might mean, afraid of putting more weight on your shoulders when you were already carrying so much." The letter went on to explain things I'd never known, things my grandma had kept secret because she thought she was protecting me. She wrote about how my parents hadn't died in a simple car accident like I'd always been told. They'd been driving home from a meeting with a lawyer, a meeting about selling their half of the ranch to a development company that had been pressuring them for months, offering money they desperately needed because my father's construction business had failed and they were drowning in debt. My grandma had been against the sale, had argued with my father about it, had said the ranch was bigger than any one generation's problems, and that selling it would be betraying everyone who'd worked to keep it in the family. The accident happened on a night when roads were icy and visibility was poor, my father driving too fast because he was angry, because he and my grandma had fought about the sale that morning, and he'd stormed out saying things he didn't mean, things about how the ranch had been a burden his whole life, and he was tired of sacrificing everything for land that gave nothing back. The development company had backed off after my parents died, had sent condolences, and disappeared for a few years. But they'd come back when I was 12, with new offers and new pressure, and my grandma had refused every time, had taken on debt to keep the ranch running, had worked herself past the point where her body could handle it, all because she believed this place was worth fighting for, worth suffering for, worth everything she had to give. "I'm telling you this now," the letter continued, "not to make you feel guilty or obligated, but because you deserve to know what you're really choosing between. Summit Ridge Resorts is the same company that pressured your parents, the same people who've been trying to get this land for 27 years. They're not interested in preserving anything or honoring what this place means. They want to clear it, develop it, turn it into something that makes them money, while erasing every trace of the family that built a life here. If you sell to them, I won't blame you from wherever I am. You've earned the right to make your own choices, to live your own life without being chained to the past or to responsibilities you never asked for. $11,000 is nothing to be ashamed of taking, and anyone who judges you for it doesn't understand what you've been through or what you deserve. But if there's any part of you that wants to fight, any small piece that thinks this place might be worth saving, then I need you to know something. There's money hidden on this property, money I saved over the years by selling off small parcels of timber rights and grazing leases, money I kept in cash because I didn't trust banks after watching them foreclose on 3 of our neighbors during the recession. It's not enough to solve all your problems, but it's enough to buy you time, enough to pay off the most urgent debts and give you a chance to figure out what comes next. The money is buried in 3 locations marked on a map I've drawn on the back of this letter. I know it sounds dramatic, like something from a movie, but I was afraid of what might happen if the wrong people found out I had cash hidden. Afraid they'd come looking for it, afraid I'd be robbed or worse, afraid that desperation makes people do things they normally wouldn't. I've left you approximately $47,000, Carter. Enough to clear the debts with some left over for basic repairs. Enough to give you a real choice instead of just the illusion of one. What you do with it is up to you. Use it to save the ranch, or use it to build a life somewhere else. Either way, know that I love you, that I never stopped believing in you, that every decision I made was about giving you options even when it cost me everything. My hands were shaking so hard I almost dropped the letter. I turned it over and found a hand-drawn map showing the property with 3 X marks, each one labeled with a depth and a brief description of what I'd find there. One near the old well house at 4 feet, one behind the barn under the 3rd fence post from the corner at 5 feet, one in the root cellar beneath a loose stone at 3 feet. Patricia was watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between sympathy and curiosity. "Did you know about this?" I asked, my voice rough. She shook her head. "Your grandmother never mentioned money to me. She only said the letter contained information that might change your decision and that you deserve to have all the facts before choosing." I looked at the map again, at my grandma's shaky handwriting marking places where she'd buried hope and possibility and a future she wouldn't live to see. $47,000 meant I didn't have to sell. Meant I could pay off the debts and still have enough left over to start repairs, to make the place livable, to maybe even figure out how to turn it into something that could sustain itself. But it also meant choosing to stay in a place that had taken everything from the people I loved, that had cost my parents their lives and my grandma her health and her happiness. It meant taking on responsibility for land that had been more burden than blessing for 3 generations. It meant believing I could succeed where everyone before me had struggled and failed. I spent the rest of that day digging in snow that came up to my knees, using a shovel I found in the barn that had a cracked handle and a blade worn thin from decades of use. Patricia had offered to stay and help, but I'd told her I needed to do this alone, needed time to think without someone watching and waiting for decisions I wasn't ready to make. She'd left me her phone number and driven back toward Whitefish, her SUV disappearing down the road in a cloud of exhaust that hung in the cold air long after she was gone. The first location was the easiest. The well house, a small shed that still had most of its roof, protected from the worst of the weather. I cleared snow away from the entrance and dug where the map indicated 4 feet down in earth that was frozen in the top layer but softer beneath. And after an hour of work that left my shoulders burning and my hands blistered even through the gloves I'd found in the barn, I hit something solid. A metal box, military surplus like something my grandpa might have brought back from Vietnam, sealed with duct tape that had gone brittle with age. Inside were stacks of bills, hundreds and fifties wrapped in plastic bags, and a note in my grandma's handwriting that said, "First third, use it wisely." I counted it twice to make sure I wasn't imagining things. $15,000 that smelled like earth and time, and the faith of someone who believed I'd come back eventually, who believed I'd make a choice that honored what she'd tried to build. The second location took longer, the fence post behind the barn requiring me to dig through snow and frozen manure from cattle that hadn't been kept here in years. And by the time I reached 5 feet, my hands were shaking from cold and exhaustion. But I found it, another metal box, this one containing $16,000, and a note that said, "Second third for repairs and hope." The sun was setting by the time I made it to the root cellar. A stone structure built into the side of a small hill behind the house, its door hanging on rusted hinges that screamed when I pulled them open. Inside it was dark and smelled like potatoes that had rotted decades ago, and I had to use the flashlight Patricia had left behind to find the loose stone my grandma had marked on the map. Beneath it, wrapped in canvas and sealed with wax, was the final box containing $16,000 and a photograph I wasn't expecting. It showed me at 7 years old, sitting on my grandpa's shoulders while my grandma stood next to us laughing, all of us in front of the barn when it was still straight and red and whole, before my parents died, before everything fell apart, before I knew what it meant to lose people you loved and spend years trying to figure out how to keep living anyway. On the back of the photograph, my grandma had written, "This is who you come from. This is what we were before grief found us. Don't let the hard years make you forget there was joy here once, and there can be again if you're willing to fight for it." I sat on the floor of that root cellar with $47,000 in cash and a photograph of a family that didn't exist anymore, and I finally let myself cry, let out grief I'd been holding back since the social worker told me my grandma was gone, since I'd stood in a parking lot with a plastic bag wondering where to go next, since I'd been 16 and scared and took a plea deal for something I didn't do because I thought it was the only choice I had. I cried for my grandma, who'd died alone while I was locked up unable to help her. I cried for my parents, who'd argued about money and land and died angry without getting a chance to make things right. I cried for the kid I'd been at 7, sitting on my grandpa's shoulders and not knowing that everything good was about to end. And I cried for myself, for 2 years lost to a system that didn't care about context or truth, for opportunities I'd never get back, for the version of my life I might have had if things had been different. But sitting there in the dark with my grandma's words and her faith and her gift of a real choice, I realized something. The past couldn't be changed, but the future wasn't written yet. I could sell the ranch and walk away with money in my pocket and no obligations, start fresh somewhere nobody knew about the reformatory or the plea deal or the mistakes that had defined me for 2 years. That was a valid choice, maybe even the smart one. Or I could stay. I could use the money my grandma had hidden to pay off the debts and start repairs. I could spend the 60 days before foreclosure figuring out if this place could be saved, if I could turn it into something that honored the people who'd fought to keep it while also building something new, something mine. I could choose to believe that broken things could be fixed, that land marked by grief could also hold healing, that a kid who'd lost 2 years to injustice could still build a life worth living. That night I slept in my grandma's bed, wrapped in blankets that smelled like lavender and memories. And when I woke up the next morning to sunlight streaming through cracked windows and snow that had fallen during the night covering everything in fresh white, I knew what my decision was. I called Patricia from the phone in the kitchen after I figured out how to get the landline reconnected using some of the cash. When she answered, I didn't waste time with small talk or explanations. "I'm keeping it," I said. "The ranch, all of it. Tell Summit Ridge their offer is rejected." There was a pause, and then Patricia's voice came back warmer than I'd heard it before. "I was hoping you'd say that," she said. "Your grandmother would be proud. I spent the next 2 months working harder than I'd ever worked in my life. I hired contractors from town to fix the roof and repair the foundation, paid them with cash that made them raise eyebrows but not ask questions. I learned how to replace windows and patch walls and coax the wood stove back to life so the house stayed warm even when temperatures dropped below 0. I cleared snow and fixed fences and started planning what I'd do when spring came, how I'd plant a garden and maybe get some chickens and figure out how to make this place sustainable instead of just survivable. People in town started to recognize me, started to nod when I came into the hardware store or the diner, started to treat me like someone who belonged instead of someone just passing through. An old rancher named Bill, who'd known my grandpa, offered to teach me about cattle if I ever decided to run some on the property. A woman named Sarah, who worked at the feed store, mentioned her son was looking for work and might be interested in helping with repairs. Slowly, without meaning to, I was building connections, putting down roots in a place I'd inherited but was starting to make my own. On what would have been my grandma's 74th birthday, I sat on the porch she'd loved and watched the sun set over mountains that had witnessed 3 generations of my family, struggling and surviving and refusing to give up, even when giving up would have been easier. And I understood finally what she'd been trying to tell me in that letter, what she'd known I'd need to figure out on my own. Home isn't just a place you inherit. It's something you choose, something you build, something you fight for even when the odds say you should walk away. It's showing up every day and doing the work even when you're tired and scared and not sure you're strong enough. It's believing that your story doesn't end with your worst moments, that broken things can be repaired, that second chances are real if you're brave enough to take them. I was 18 years old, fresh out of a reformatory, sitting on a porch of a ranch I'd saved with money my grandma had buried like seeds, waiting for the right season to grow. I didn't know if I'd succeed, if I could make this place work where others had struggled. But I knew I was going to try, and that was enough for now. If you made it all the way to the end of this story, then you already know this wasn't just about a ranch or hidden money or inheritance. This was about finding out who you are when everything's been stripped away, when you're standing at a crossroads and nobody can tell you which path to take. Listen, I need you to do something for me. Hit that subscribe button right now, because this channel is about real stories for real people who've been through things and came out the other side. Drop a comment and tell me, what's the most important lesson you learned from Carter's story? Was it about second chances, about fighting for what matters, about choosing the hard path because it's the right one? Share your thoughts, share your own story if you're comfortable, because this community is built on people supporting each other through the tough times. We're all in this together, and your voice matters here. Now tell me, what did this story teach you about yourself?